Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you are watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. 20 Palestinians were killed at an aid distribution point run by the US-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. 19 were trampled and 1 stabbed after armed agitators sparked a crowd surge. The UN Rights Office says it has recorded at least 875 deaths near Gaza aid sites in the past 6 weeks, mostly around GHF centers. Clashes between Syrian troops and local Druze fighters restarted in Sweida Wednesday, collapsing a ceasefire agreed hours earlier to end days of sectarian bloodshed. The fighting in the Druze stronghold highlights minorities' distrust toward Syria's Islamist-led government. Russia launched 400 drones and a missile overnight, striking energy infrastructure and wounding at least 15 people across Kharkiv, Kryvyi Rih, and Vinnytsia. Ukrainian officials earlier said 2 people were killed in a separate drone strike on the frontline city of Kupiansk. US President Donald Trump will meet Qatar's Prime Minister Sheikh Al-Thani today to discuss the ongoing Gaza ceasefire negotiations. Axios reports Israeli and Hamas teams have been in talks in Doha since July 6 over a US-backed 60-day truce plan that includes hostage releases and Israeli troop withdrawals. Iran's parliament said today that Tehran should not resume nuclear negotiations. Lawmakers warned that Washington uses talks to deceive Iran and shield Israeli attacks, saying no new negotiations can occur until conditions are fulfilled. Indonesia's president has hailed a new era in ties with the United States after President Donald Trump agreed to slash tariffs on Indonesian imports. The deal comes amid Trump's global trade reboot and gives Southeast Asia's largest economy key access to the U.S. market at a lower rate than other regional peers. A war monitor says at least 248 people have died in southern Syria's Sweida province after days of clashes that forced a government troop deployment. The Syrian Observatory says 92 Druze-majority members were among the dead, including 28 civilians and 21 allegedly executed by the government forces. An EU court has rejected an appeal by Jean-Marie Le Pen's heirs against a European Parliament's decision to recover about €300,000 in unjustified expenses. Judges said the repayment procedure did not breach legal certainty or legitimate expectations. Indonesia has confirmed it has reached a trade agreement with the United States following what officials described as an extraordinary struggle. During negotiations, the deals finalized after a call between U.S. President Donald Trump and Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto lowers proposed U.S. tariffs on Indonesian goods to 19%, down from the initially threatened 32%. President Trump announced the agreement on Tuesday, calling it one of the several key trade pacts his administration aims to finalize before an August 1st deadline. Indonesian officials praised the outcome, with presidential spokesperson Hassan Nasbi crediting the nation's negotiating team, led by the coordinating minister for economic affairs, for securing favorable terms. On his official Instagram account, President Prabowo described the conversations with Trump as very good and said both sides agreed to bring trade relations into what he called a new era. Here's what the Indonesian president's spokesperson had to say.
Ini kemajuan yang juga tidak bisa dibilang kemajuan yang kecil. Tidak bisa juga dibilang sebuah keberhasilan yang kecil. Ini melalui perjuangan yang luar biasa dari tim negosiasi kita yang dipimpin oleh Menko Perekonomian ini merupakan negosiasi yang juga luar biasa yang dilakukan oleh presiden kita secara langsung dengan Presiden Donald Trump, dan ini titik temu antara pemerintah kita dengan pemerintah.
Meanwhile, some Indonesians are voicing concerns over the newly announced trade agreement with the United States. According to reports, critics have said that the deal feels one-sided with no matching tariffs on U.S. goods. Let's take a look at what they had to say.
Kita ke sana dikenakan 19%, pihak dari sana mintanya 0%. Itu kurang fair juga sih, itu aja.
Now we're joined by Peter Cordillo. He's a chief market economist at Spartan Capital Securities, joining us live from New York. Thank you, Peter, for joining us today. Good to see you. How significant is the new U.S.-Indonesia trade agreement on shaping broader economic relations between Southeast Asia and the United States?
Well, I think it's significant, and it's one step going probably the right direction. So, as you know, I've said in the past that I believe these steep tariffs are likely to change, and of course, I think that's basically what's in the cards in the coming days. I think there'll be tariff negotiations that will settle at lower tariffs, and of course that will help alleviate some of the inflation fears.
And do you think this signals a shift in the U.S. administration's trade priorities before the August 1st deadline?
I think so. President Trump is taking a hard line, and so is his administration. But again, deadlines, usually bring forward some sort of reversal in thinking, and if the negotiations are accepted by both parts, then I think you have a lasting agreement that will be less, will have a less negative effect on the economies that are involved, along with the inflationary aspect.
And Peter, what does the reduction of U.S. tariffs from 32% to 19% mean for Indonesian exporters, and how might it impact domestic industries in Indonesia?
Well, it's going to impact, there's no question about it, but it all depends. And again, any change in any reversal in the initial proposals, or the initial agreement, I should say, that will help relieve some of the tensions, and above all, certainly relieve some of the negative impact. But it's going to have some negative impact, there's no question about it, but not to the point where perhaps it could mean severe negative economic activity for a lot of these countries.
And given the extraordinary struggle mentioned by Indonesian officials, what do you think were the key sticking points during these negotiations?
Well, I think, they are likely to have to accept some of the terms that Trump and his administration want. But obviously, I think they will negotiate lower levels. It's a question of negotiations and whether or not, their position is well taken by the Trump administration.
Thank you, Peter, for sharing that. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic. Yes, President Donald Trump has on Tuesday suggested Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent could be a candidate to lead the Federal Reserve, but stopped short of confirming any decision to replace current Fed Chair Jerome Powell, whose term runs until May 2026. Here's what the U.S. President had to say about Scott Bessent.
Well, he's an option. And he's very good. Well, he's not, because I like the job he's doing. Right. That's why he's coming. He's older. I'd like to, I don't know if he was on the plan. I don't know. Maybe he wasn't. But I do like the job he's done. So, in that sense, probably it's not that much of an opposite. But Scott's been great. He's Mr. Ribby. He did a good job today. He's a very soothing force. You know, it's soothing. All right.
Trump has long criticized Powell, accusing him of keeping interest rates too high. On Tuesday, the president renewed his complaints, this time over a $2.5 billion renovation project at the Fed's historic Washington headquarters, calling the cost overruns potentially a firing offense. U.S. President Donald Trump has said that suggested Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent could be a candidate to lead the Federal Reserve, but stopped short of confirming any decision to replace current Fed Chair Jerome Powell, whose term runs until May 2026. Trump has long criticized Jerome Powell, accusing him of keeping interest rates too high. On Tuesday, the president renewed his complaints, this time over a $2.5 billion renovation project at the Fed's historic Washington headquarters, calling the cost overruns potentially a firing offense. U.S. President Donald Trump on Tuesday suggested Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent could be a candidate to lead the Federal Reserve. Now we move on to our next news. U.S. President Donald Trump has said Attorney General Pam Bondi should release whatever she thinks is credible on sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, as he faces rare backlash from supporters after seeking to draw a line under the case. Bondi has been lambasted by some of Trump's political base after she said last week there was no evidence that Epstein kept a client list or was blackmailing powerful figures. At the weekend, Trump urged supporters not to waste time and energy on the controversy, but allies of the president, including House of Representatives Speaker Mike Johnson, are calling for transparency. Here's what the U.S. president had to say.
Interested in the Epstein story and so upset about how it's been handled. Why do you think that is?
Why they would be so interested? He's dead for a long time. He was never a big factor in terms of life. I don't understand what the interest or what the assassination is. I really don't. And the credible information has been given. Don't forget, we went through years of the Mueller witch hunt and all of the different things, the Steele dossier, which was all fake. All that information is fake. But I don't understand why the Jeffrey Epstein case would be of interest to anybody. It's pretty boring stuff. It's sordid, but it's boring. And I don't understand why it keeps going. I think, well, really only pretty bad people, including fake news, want to keep something like Jack Gordon. But credible information, let them give it. Anything that's credible, I would say, let them have it.
Now we're joined by Mark Sutherland for this discussion. He's a geopolitical commentator joining us live from London. Thank you, Mark, for joining us today. Welcome to NewsX World. Now, how important is transparency for political figures linked to such high-profile controversies?
The Epstein case, if we're referring to that, has been going on for a long time in regard to the political chatter. One of the biggest problem is that before Trump was elected, he then turns around and says, we'll release all the files, we'll get every information out there. And the reason why there has been such a reaction from his base is after Pam Bondi, it's inferring, and also him saying there's nothing to see here. Why is it going on? That chatter is not helpful, because as he said Russia, the Steele, etc. There's been so much that's gone on in regard to his first administration. Now in the second, it's when these promises have been made, like he said, I'll also release any files on the shooting of Kennedy in '63. So that is why it's causing this controversy. It's making a promise and then not fulfilling that in people's eyes.
And with calls for transparency coming from both Trump's allies and opponents, how should the Attorney General balance legal confidentiality and public demand for disclosure in cases involving powerful individuals?
But you've just said it. This is this whole thing of balancing the disclosure of powerful individuals. That's why people have had enough of this, because they just think that powerful individuals are then being protected. Because if you then see people like Bill Clinton in a blue dress on a painting, wearing, I believe the blue dress that they're referring to is one that Monica Lewinsky wore in regard to the whole scandal of inappropriate behavior that Clinton had with his intern at that time and abuse of that power. So this is why it goes back and back, and people feel that they are gaslighting. In regard to protecting certain individuals, that is why people have been getting very, very upset about it, because they've said, just lay it all out. People have got things to hide on both sides of the aisle, tough, because there is a phrase. The phrase is uniparty. People feel that both parties are actually unified against the people. That's why, having been through the whole Jan 6 situation, where people were then accused of, an insurrection and all of this kind of thing. That's a subject that would take about 2 hours, which I'm more than willing to talk about. But this is why, on that, with also previous covering up, people have really had enough and have grown extremely suspicious. They just want the whole thing out there. And if people on their side, say on the Republican side, are guilty of this, so be it. They need to be exposed. I suppose the other thing, just quickly on it, it's saying that it wouldn't have surprised, as Trump has alluded to, and others, that maybe the Democrats have spent the last 4 years, getting rid of certain files, doctoring certain things to then accuse their opponents. We really don't know. The number one thing is that people want around the world is they want the truth, and they want their governments to be truthful to them. That seems to be a rare commodity these days.
Yes, indeed. And now, what impact does President Trump's call for Attorney General Pam Bondi to release whatever she thinks is credible have on public trust in this Epstein investigation?
Time will tell, because one thing that they've got to bear in mind, they've got the midterm elections coming up, and people in midterms in regard to bang in the middle of his administration of 4 years. And the discussion has already been that they would lose, that there could be 40% of potential seats that they could lose, and because people are not convinced by this. He is trying to stand by his attorney general. That's why he said release everything. Sees maybe that this hasn't been helpful in regard to various other things that were said last weekend. And people like dear Lara Trump was out speaking about it, trying to be positive about it, as were others in regard to the administration. You then realize that the number one thing you've got to do is to say, look, just release everything. The worry is that people are going to question that. They're going to turn around and say, well, Pam Bondi, are you actually going to release everything? There is this rumor, because you've got Kash Patel as head of the FBI, you've got Dan Bongino is number two. Dan Bongino has a big podcast. He spent for a number of years saying this has got to be released. Now, if he actually then resigned from the FBI, just give you an idea, then gets back into running his podcast, people are going to say, well, we don't believe you, Dan. You've been inside. What have you actually done? So now that's what people are saying about Pam Bondi. There was a discussion that suddenly on the independent news and chatter that Matt Gaetz was then suddenly called back to the White House. We don't know, but I do feel that there is going to be a strategy to say, well, look, we haven't handled this very well. We just need to release everything. But the problem is people are now in such doubt that they're going to go, well, we still don't believe you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mark, for sharing that. Please stay with us as we stay in the region. Amid the growing tensions between US and EU, China's foreign ministry has said that China and the EU Parliament were lifting all restriction on mutual exchange. At the time, the Chinese foreign ministry said the members of the European Parliament, Reinhard Bütikofer, Michael Gahler, Raphael Glucksmann, Ilhan Küçük, and Miriam Lexman were among those who severely harmed China's sovereignty and interests and maliciously spread lies and disinformation. Let's listen into what China had to say.
几年，中欧的立法机构交往，因为众所周知的原因，出现了一些波折。当前形势下，双方都认为中欧加强对话合作十分重要。经双方商定，中方和欧洲议会决定同步全面取消对相互交往的限制。我们相信并期待，随着中欧全面恢复立法机构交往，双方的交流和理解将更加深入，将为中欧关系的持续健康稳定发展注入。
Now we go back to our guest discussion with Mark Sutherland. He's a geopolitical commentator. Thank you, Mark, for staying with us. Now, what does this China's decision to lift all restriction on mutual exchange with the EU Parliament signal about Beijing's diplomatic strategy towards Europe?
Well, the big issue is that China is the second biggest, growing to be maybe the first biggest economy within the world. This is the war that's going on. The Silk Road strategy goes deep into most areas of Europe as well, because people want the money, people want the trade. It's all about, at the end of the day, they're using this diplomatically to then gain influence. They already have that over here, say within the UK. A number of years ago, under Theresa May, there was the whole Huawei row. We have a lot of foreign students from China within the UK as well. This brings revenue. One of the reasons why we were concerned about Huawei was from whether that could be used for devious means. When David Cameron was Prime Minister, soon after coming there with George Osborne, his Chancellor of the Exchequer, they flew off to China to start negotiating deals, etc. The fact is that a lot of, as we know, many companies have moved their industrial power base to China. So it's the manufacturing capital of the world. So it's in the European Union's economies are not in a good state at all. So there has to they want the Chinese investment. They want to be able to trade with China, not have tariffs. But of course, China wants the influence, and the influence that it is having. We have to be extremely cautious about it, because in 1978, when they turned around and got sort of state support behind the liberalization of their economy. It's taken a long time, but we now see how powerful they are, because they want to be number one in the world. This is what we are all dealing with. As I've said previously on other shows, they want a multipolar world. They want to be influential. That's why they are very much part of leading the BRICS nations.
And Mark, now building on that and looking at China's criticism, how significant is China's strong criticism of specific European Parliament members with their names publicized, accusing them of harming China's sovereignty and spreading disinformation?
Well, I could sort of cheekily sit here and say they are not in a position to talk, but the thing is, they are extremely powerful. They have huge. Our economies have been pumping a heck of a lot of money into their economy. We've actually built them up ever since Kissinger And President Nixon, all those years ago, going back 72, 73, went into China and began to open it up. Many companies, as I said, have handed over their manufacturing industry to that part of the world. They are in an extremely powerful position. We only have to look at the Silk Road strategy that they've done in regard to Africa and seeking commodities, saying we will build this infrastructure for you, but we want access to the commodities that your country has, e.g. minerals, etc. They are in a very powerful position to flex their muscles. This is why the onus, and this is where people are at, this is why Trump is doing it, which is to get manufacturing and jobs back into America, other European countries. That is what they actually need to do to get jobs back into Europe. But this is extremely difficult because of the competition that China has in regard to having a lower wage economy. But they also have a challenge there as well, because the Chinese people are demanding more and more wage increases, etc. So it's a very interesting time. But we would be very stupid if we underestimated the power that they have. We had our own Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, a few months ago, going over there, cap in hand, asking for money and for lending. The other thing, just quickly, we've got to bear in mind is that most European economies, including the UK and particularly France as well, others, are in huge debt, and that huge debt very often may end up leading back to China and the amount of money that's lent and the reserves that they have, but also in regard to the investment the Chinese make in countries. If it's about power and ideology and being number one, we have to be, as I say, we have to be very cautious of that. And that's why I always thought we had nation states where individual nations can stand on their own 2 feet, have courtesy, wonderful interaction with the other nations around them, but to then be able to invest, but more, be able to protect their own economy and have good competition. China doesn't want that, because at the end of the day, they want to be the competition, e.g. number one in the world, and dictate to other countries.
Yes, indeed. Mark, thank you for sharing that. Please stay with us as we move on to our next news. Russian forces have taken control of Novokhatsk in eastern Ukraine, meeting of Patriot owner nations and Ukraine donors aiming to find additional Patriot air defense batteries for Kyiv. It could take place next week and be chaired by the NATO's top military commander. Meanwhile, one person has been killed after being wounded in a Ukrainian drone attack on Russia's Voronezh region. The incident was confirmed by the region's governor, Alexander Gusev. In Ukraine, Russia launched a massive overnight assault, sending over 400 drones and a ballistic missile, primarily targeting Kharkiv, Kryvyi Rih, and Vinnytsia. The strikes hit energy infrastructure, leaving at least 15 people injured. Ukrainian forces claimed to have intercepted most of the drones, but 12 targets were still struck. President Volodymyr Zelensky vowed to restore power supply in affected regions, emphasizing the need for more air defenses to counter Russian aggression. The relentless drone attacks by Russia continue, with air defense systems being crucial in defending Ukrainian cities. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Mark Sutherland. Thank you, Mark, for staying with us. With Russia taking control of Novokhatsk and launching a large-scale drone assault, is Ukraine at risk of losing further ground without a significant increase in Western air defense support?
The biggest comment to say, overarching all of this, is that we all want this war to end. And the big issue is that, as Trump has said, he's trying to get these people to the table to have this discussion and stop this. And it is continuing. And of course, within these conversations, which says, right, look, we need to have a ceasefire by this date, we need to have a ceasefire by this particular date, they get pushed back. And of course, Russia would then turn around and say, well, we need to take as much land as we can to build a buffer zone to protect our nation. So it's always playing for time. But this, we're discussing this, sitting back, in regard to the fact that people are being killed on both sides. There is this, the American administration, it looks like they are sending certain armaments to Ukraine. These missiles could then reach deep into Russia. This is deeply concerning. Then, of course, with Russia sending drone swarms, that's rather interesting, because with what's recently happened to Iran, they get a lot of their drones. Iran supply a lot of their drone technology. With after Israel bombing them, it's rather interesting to see if that will peter out. Where will they then get the other drones from? In many ways, we could go on and on about this, of saying the rights are wrong. We need this to stop. The de-escalation has to stop, because it is escalating up. And the other thing is, in regard to missiles, with the certain ranges that they have, with certain technology that Russia has, it has a long reach. And if the escalation then continues, and you can understand it, the countries are going to say, well, we're going to protect ourselves. We're not having the verbal assaults on us. You could say to the West, West, you have been providing Ukraine weapons. It's like a proxy war against Russia. The number one thing is to de-escalate it. But as usual, when we've had certain voices in the past, like Boris Johnson, who have then flown over there and then stopped any negotiation of peace within 2 weeks. Back in 2022, there are many questions to ask, because thousands of people have died and there is destruction within the Ukraine, and many, as I say, many people on both sides have died, and this has to stop.
With that in mind, Mark, can Kyiv realistically protect its energy infrastructure through current means, or is escalation of Western military aid inevitable?
I think you're right. I think it will be inevitable, because protecting the way the Russians fight is to draw the army out, is not to maybe necessarily, even though of course that's happened, but in their sort of military strategy from day one, it's about actually taking the military on, trying to not touch certain aspects of civilian infrastructure, etc. But it is going to be difficult unless Ukraine have the weapons to protect their electrical substations, etc., etc. As these kind of attacks then accelerate. But as I say, it's this whole thing of the meat grinder. The Russians have wanted to draw the military personnel on the Ukraine side into a fight to then defeat them without necessarily damaging and getting into the civil structure of Ukraine itself. But they, of course, over the last few years, have also engaged in that. But it's how they fight. But Ukraine, yes, if you've thrown nearly, 850,000 casualties or whatever, you're throwing men after men into it. I mean, Russia have been getting men from North Korea. I even believe there's been Iranian soldiers sent in there as well. Ukraine, that's the problem. It needs the military hardware to defend itself, and then Russia will see that as an escalation by the West.
Thank you, Mark, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic. Now we move on to our next news. The Kremlin has expressed heightened concern over Western weapon supplies to Ukraine, emphasizing that it is actively monitoring the situation. Dmitry Peskov, a Kremlin spokesperson, stated that these supplies are primarily a business transaction, with some European countries expected to foot the bill. He also noted that while there are no immediate plans for a phone call between Russian President Vladimir Putin and US President Donald Trump, such a conversation could be arranged swiftly if needed. The issue of arms shipments to Ukraine remains a central point in ongoing tensions between Russia and the West. Now we go back to our guest discussion with Mark Sutherland. He's a geopolitical expert. Thank you, Mark, for staying with us. How does the Kremlin's framing of Western weapon supplies to Ukraine as primarily a business transaction reflect Russia's stance on international involvement in this conflict?
Well, I've just said it earlier. They are concerned about more and more weapons going into the theater of war, on both sides, no matter how people dress that up. If we then, as it's saying, that the American administration wants to give Kiev certain weapons, Trump is also looking for a deal to say, right, I'm going to park these missiles within the Ukrainian theater of war with Russia. Now, Vladimir, will you please come to the table? The brinkmanship will go so far and so far and so far. The concern is within the brinkmanship that you then press the button and intercontinental, a sort of a potential nuclear exchange could then happen. You know that, I mean, that is the kind of situation that we could be looking at, that we want to avoid. To actually turn around and say, yeah, other people would say certain things in regard to maybe a business transaction. The problem is, in this situation on both sides, the amount of people that have been killed, this could have been negotiated to end a long time ago. It's then, for some reason, it suited people to then keep expanding that. As I was explaining, I think yesterday on the channel, that we have to go back in history. We end up going back to the coup in 2014 in regard to the Ukraine. We then go back to the Minsk agreement. We go back to promising Russia, when the wall came down in 1989, that NATO would not expand up to its border. There are so many different factors to understand, to realize that if you keep, this is my opinion, others would of course disagree, but if you keep poking the bear, then this is what you then get. And then other people turn around and say, well, Vladimir wishes to, remember, Kyiv was the traditional Russian capital, and turn around and say, well, the Russian would like their empire back and like to expand. I don't necessarily agree with that. If we go back to what was happening in the Crimea and the Donbass and on that border, they are Russian speaking, and it's how they were then treated, and a number of years ago told, we don't want you to speak Russia anymore. All of these tensions have built up to this situation, and it's not a video game like in any area around the world. There is deep complexities that we have to try and understand. This is not a video game. We don't press a button and, we can just wipe the screen and start the game again. No, people are getting killed by their thousands in this situation.
Thank you very much, Mark Sutherland, for joining us and sharing your insight throughout our news as a geopolitical expert. Now we move on to our next news. Clashes have resumed in Syria's Druze city of Sweida after a ceasefire collapsed just hours after being announced, amid days of deadly sectarian fighting. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the death toll in southern Syria has risen to 248, including 92 Druze, 28 of them being civilians, with 21 reportedly executed by government troops. Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, has warned the Syrian government to leave the Druze in Sweida alone, threatening escalated strikes if Syrian forces do not withdraw. Katz stated that the IDF will continue to strike Syrian government positions until they pull back from the area. Now we're joined by Yeshaya Rosenman. He's an Israel journalist joining us live from Jerusalem. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to NewsX World. Now, what are the underlying causes of the renewed sectarian clashes in Sweida, and how has this collapse of the ceasefire affected humanitarian situation on the ground.
Yes, so good afternoon. In order to properly understand the conflict, you must understand the history of the Druze ethnic minority. I can say, I think 3 points should be pointed out. One, the Druze are a community that left Islam in the 12th century. They left the Shia empire, the Fatimid empire of Egypt. They left Islam. They moved out to Syria because they were no longer Muslims and they were persecuted. They moved to the region that the Druze mountain in Syria and the vicinity in southern Lebanon, northern Israel, and southern Syria, that vicinity. So they are not Muslims. That is the first thing to understand, according to their own understanding and according to understanding of the Muslim surroundings. The second thing to understand is that the Druze have a policy of being loyal to any kingdom or monarch or democracy in which they live if he does not persecute them. So the Druze, therefore, are loyal to the Lebanese government, the Israeli government, and had a tenuous relationship with the Syrian government because it was a very repressive regime. The third thing to understand is that the Druze have a military, a martial tradition, similar in India, similar to the Sikh minority, maybe. So they serve in the Israeli armed forces.
Yeshaya, your connection might be interrupted. Now we move on to our next news. Thank you, Yeshaya, for joining us today and sharing your insight. Now we move on to our next news. 20 Palestinians were killed today at an aid site in Khan Yunis. It's run by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF. Let's listen into what a Gazan witness had to say.
خنق راح فتح الحلابه صارت الناس شوي تنبز اللي يضغط يركب فوق الثاني ضغط صار الناس الشاب هذا المستشهد جنبي كان صار يستنجد بالامريكي يقول له دخيلك بس تخطى لقين نخوف الناس عنده موته وهو ابدا بقول خليك بعمل له ايه مساعدات هذه والله مصيده والله ما هي مساعدات طخوا علينا وبرموا علينا قنابل وبيرشوا علينا فلفل بيحرقوا عينينا.
The US-backed group said 19 people were trampled and one stabbed after a crowd surge. It claimed was instigated by armed agitators affiliated with Hamas. This comes as the United Nations Rights Office said that it has documented at least 875 deaths near aid sites over the past 6 weeks, most of them being near GHF locations. Palestinian health officials, however, have said that suffocation caused the deaths. The UN has continuously criticized GHF's model as unsafe and politicized. GHF operates outside the UN aid system using private US contractors and logistics contractors to deliver aid. "20 Palestinians were killed today at an aid site in Khan Yunis, run by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF. Let's listen in to what a Gazan witness had to say. Now we'll skip that bite. The US-backed group has said that 19 people were trampled and one stabbed after a crowd surge. It claimed it was instigated by armed agitators affiliated with Hamas. This comes as the United Nations Rights Office said that it has documented at least 875 deaths near aid sites over the past 6 weeks, most of them being GHF locations. Now we're joined by Thomas Porteous. He's an anchor and reporter at NewsX World.
Yes, Asuma, I just want to give you a bit more information on what has happened. This is a repeated occurrence, it seems. We seem to get facts and figures about some of the events that occur at these GHF sites on a regular basis. This time the information comes from the GHF itself, blaming Palestinians for causing a crowd crush. We now know that the GHF has said that 19 people have been involved in this crush. 19 people have lost their lives and one being fatally stabbed within a scramble for aid. The GHF is a highly controversial organization backed by both Israel and ran by the United States. It quickly came in after international condemnation was widespread after Israel's 2-month blockade of the Gaza Strip, which prevented companies like the United Nations and other humanitarian companies from distributing aid in the Gaza Strip. Israel cites the fact that Hamas was looting these trucks in order before they were reaching the civilians that they needed. However, as you said previously, upwards of 800 people, some say over 800 people, have now been killed in the time that this foundation has been operating in the Strip. And Israel denies this, but the organizations like the United Nations, they say that this is complete, this humanitarian foundation doesn't know how to run. It's inexperienced is what they claim, and obviously it's leading to the deaths of 800 people upwards just trying to seek aid. There has been visuals released, compelling visuals of people scrambling towards these aid sites in order to get the aid that they need. However, Israel denies any wrongdoing in aid distribution and claims that millions of Palestinians have now been fed through the GHF. However, the aid organization still remains a highly controversial organization.
Thank you, Thomas, for sharing that insight. Now we move on. Now we have a breaking news. In a fresh escalation in the sectarian tensions in Syria, Syria's state media has said that Israeli drones have struck the Druze-majority city of Sweida. Additionally, the Israeli military has said it struck the entrance of the Syrian army's headquarters in Damascus. Now we go back to our Rep Live with Thomas Porteous. Thomas, what more can you tell us about the breaking news that has just come in?
Well, Asuma, tensions are once again escalating Syria. This comes just days after we saw major investment in Damascus. This also comes after Donald Trump lifted sanctions on the country. Ahmed al-Shara leads Syria and has promised introductions to the West, hence the sanctions being lifted. Anyway, sectarian violence continues. Months after the fall of Bashar al-Assad late last year, over 240 people have now been confirmed dead in the past 24 hours, according to reports from the region, with an Israeli strike hitting the HQ of military operations in the Syrian capital. This comes hours just after a ceasefire saying Israel won't bomb the country of Syria anymore. Just hours later, it just has, and the Syrian capital as well. But we will bring you all the updates in regards to this situation.
Thank you, Thomas, for sharing that. Now we are joined back by Yeshaya Rosenman. He's an Israel journalist, joining us live from Jerusalem. Yeshaya, thank you for joining us back. What's your reaction with the Druze and continuous attacks on Druze minority in Syria?
Yes, so as I began to say before I lost connection, the basic problem is that the Druze are not Muslims, and Ahmed al-Shara's regime are in essence jihadists, regardless of whether they want to show moderation for Western audiences. In essence, they have never left the hardcore, hardline Islamist approach of Al-Qaeda and other affiliated organizations. Therefore, they are on an inherent clash with the Druze, who are not Muslims. That is the basic problem, the tolerance of minorities, of non-Muslim minorities in Syria. Therefore, what we have seen now, even though the conflict erupted over a local dispute that escalated between Druze and the surrounding Bedouin tribes. The basic issue is the ability of Ahmed al-Shara's regime to tolerate non-Muslims in it at all, okay? And this goes for the Druze or the Alawites, the group in which former President Bashar al-Assad belonged to.
And Yesha, what's your reaction with the breaking news that had just come in that Israel has struck headquarters of the army in Damascus?
Yes, so you have to understand that given the loyalty of the Druze to the Israeli government, they have a martial tradition. They serve in the Israeli military, police force. The head of the Druze community, the spiritual leader, Muwafaq Parif, in Israel, had cried out that a shocking and cruel massacre of Druze is happening in Syria, and the Israeli government and IDF are not doing anything. Therefore, this morning we saw a response from Defense Minister Israel Katz that Israel will escalate its responses if the Syrian forces do not withdraw from Sweida. They did not withdraw, and therefore Israel started attacking a variety of targets of the Syrian army, first tanks and forces, army forces, missile launchers, etc. And then recently, less than an hour ago, they attacked the base of the Syrian military, the headquarters in Damascus. So it remains to be seen how the battle will develop on the ground between the Druze and the Syrian forces, and where it will go from now.
Thank you very much, Yeshua, for sharing that insight. Please stay with us as we move on to our next news. The United Nations Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territory, Francesca Albanese, urged countries to take immediate action to halt what she described as Israel's genocide in Gaza. Speaking at a two-day international conference of the Hague Group in Bogota, Colombia, Albanese called for the full suspension of political and economic ties with Israel. Let's listen into what she had to say.
There is no one who has clean hands when it comes to Palestine. And this is not because of bad intentions of states, it's because of the interconnectedness of the global world we are part of. And therefore, there are economic and financial ties that bring also the global majority, countries in the global majority, including South Africa and Colombia, Malaysia, into this. Now, if these member states decided to stop the provision of coal to Israel and other raw materials and resources, because this is something that comes primarily from the global majority, it would have such an impact.
The Hague Bloc is a bloc of nations that have pledged to end military support to Israel and uphold the ICC's arrest warrant for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The bloc is co-chaired by Colombia and South Africa. Additionally, the Hague Bloc also reaffirmed their support to Palestine. Let's listen into what the Colombian foreign minister had to say.
Hoy, desde Bogotá, reafirmamos, Palestina no está sola. Que esta reunión marque el inicio de una acción conjunta, firme y transformadora.
Albanese warned that Israel's economy was structured to sustain the occupation and urged both governments and private sectors to cut all links. Albanese also further said that the U.S. was totally complicit in Israel's ongoing war in Gaza. Let's listen into her comments.
I do believe that the US is totally complicit with whatever Israel is doing, but to the point that with the new administration, even the forced displacement of the Palestinians, which has occurred for decades under the watch of everyone, including the United States, has become part of the US foreign policy, while declaring that Gaza is a construction site, is to be turned into the Gaza Riviera, and the Riviera of the Mediterranean Sea. And also the US is clear, not only has provided weapons, is the first arms suppliers of Israel, followed by Germany, against which there is a pending case for genocide, by the way, but has also provided political support and is really engaging into mafia-style intimidation of so many who are trying to stop it.
Now we go back to our guest discussion with Yeshaya Rosenman. He's an Israel journalist joining us live from Jerusalem. Thank you, Yeshaya, for staying with us. Now, how feasible is the call for the full suspension of political and economic ties with Israel, according to you?
0%. It will not happen. The countries that are already hostile, there are countries, many countries who do not have diplomatic relations with us, mostly in the Islamic world. There are countries who, primarily because of large Muslim voting banks, they take various actions against Israel. One example would be UK, but even UK, you have to understand, is a primary ally with the Israeli intelligence. So they put on a big show of reprimanding Israel and all sorts of theatrics, anti-Israel theatrics. But in practice, UK is a prime partner with Israeli intelligence in all issues of intelligence. So again, I think much of this, first of all, there are countries that won't even pay lip service, that like Trump's America is aligned with Israel, but even other countries that will pay lip service and make all sorts of theatrical gestures against Israel. Many of them need Israel and partner with Israel. So I don't think very many countries will heed to this call to boycott Israel.
Thank you very much, Yeshaya, for joining us today and sharing your insight throughout our news. Now we move on to our next news. In a statement, Iran's parliament has declared that nuclear talks with the United States cannot resume until certain preconditions are met. The statement, however, did not define the preconditions. The statement, carried by state media, accused the Americans of using negotiations to deceive Iran and cover up Israeli military strikes. Tehran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi had earlier demanded guarantees against future attacks. Washington had called on Iran to abandon its uranium enrichment program before a deal, a demand Iran rejects. President Trump said he's in no rush to restart talks, while France, Germany, and the UK have warned they may trigger UN sanctions snapback mechanism if there is no progress by the end of August. Now we move on to our next news. China has vowed continued support for Iran in safeguarding its sovereignty, dignity, and resisting power politics and bullying. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi made the statement during talks with his Iranian counterpart Abbas Araghchi in Tianjin today. He said Iran had a right to defend its legitimate interests through political negotiation. The meeting took place on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Foreign Ministers Summit. Now we move on to our next news. Apple TV Plus's Severance and HBO's The Penguin dominated the 2025 Emmy nominations, leading the race for TV's top honors. Severance, a psychological thriller about memory-erased office workers, earned 27 nominations, including Best Drama. HBO's The Penguin, starring Colin Farrell as the iconic DC villain, scored 24 nods, and it's up for the Best Limited Series alongside Netflix Adolescence. Hollywood satire, The Studio and Thailand Set Murder Mystery, The White Lotus, followed closely with 23 nominations each. Comedy contenders include Hacks, The Bear, Nobody Wants This, and Abbott Elementary. Veteran actor Noah Weil landed his first Emmy nomination in over 2 decades for The Pit, while 83-year-old Harrison Ford received his first ever nod for Shrinking. The Emmy winners will be announced on September 14th in Los Angeles. Let's now look at the news coming in from the world of sports. Veteran midfielder Nico Lodeiro is heading home. The Houston Dynamo have officially transferred the 36-year-old to Club Nacional de Football, his boyhood team in Uruguay. Lodeiro made his final appearance for the Dynamo in June 28. Coming off the bench for 5 minutes, he logged 1 goal and 1 assist in 16 MLS games this season. Previously, Lodeiro starred with the Seattle Sounders, winning titles in 2016 and 2019 and scoring 8 postseason goals across his career. England forward Chloe Kelly, who scored the iconic winner in the Euro 22 final, says England's substitutes have become a tight-knit group at Euro 2025. With their own WhatsApp group and a unique finger-clicking celebration, they proudly call themselves the finishers. Kelly says it's all about staying ready and uplifting each other, even when off the pitch. As England prepares for their quarter-final clash with Sweden, this strong bench unity might just prove decisive again. At the EFG Swiss Open Gstaad, it was a day of mixed fortunes for tennis veterans. Belgium's David Goffin, returning from a foot injury, battled through windy conditions to defeat 19-year-old Martin Landelus in straight sets, but local favorite Stan Wawrinka, now 40, couldn't deliver at home, losing in straight sets to Kazakhstan's Alexander Shevchenko. Goffin moves on, while Wawrinka's campaign ends in round 1. It was a wild finish at the MLB All-Star Game, as Kyle Schwarber earned MVP honors in the most unexpected way. Despite going hitless in regulation, the Phillies slugger crushed 3 home runs in the game's first ever swing-off, leading the National League to victory. With the score tied at 6, managers picked 3 players each for a mini home run derby, and Schwarber's bat proved the difference. Despite a thrilling 22-run win over India at Lord's, England have been fined docked 2 World Test Championship points for a slow overrate in the 3rd Test. The ICC found England to be 2 overs short, even though the ball had to be changed multiple times during the match. Captain Ben Stokes accepted the charge, and with no formal hearing required. The team also faces 10% match fee deduction. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.